Hey guys, tonight we dive into a world where words were swords, and bards, those medieval Irish poets and storytellers, held sway over kings and commoners alike. You trudge through misty Celtic hills, feeling the damp chills settle in your bones as you step into a smoky hall lit by flickering hearth fires. Here, the bards recite tales that shape destinies and histories. But beware, you probably won't survive the fierce scrutiny of their sharp tongues and the peculiar punishments that awaited any who dared cross the fine line of their craft. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm curious where in the world we're all settling down to this medieval storytelling session. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step into the social landscape of medieval Ireland, roughly between the 5th and 12th centuries, where society was richly woven with clans, kings, and a remarkable class of artists, the bards and poets. Unlike the wandering minstrels of later European tradition, these bards were highly trained professionals, often educated in dedicated bardic schools. They weren't merely entertainers, they were guardians of history, law, genealogy, and culture. A bard's words could praise a king to glory or cut him down with biting satire. In fact, the very survival of one's reputation in medieval Irish society often depended on the verses composed by these eloquent figures. Imagine yourself as one of these bards, robed in fine cloth, carrying the weight of ancestral knowledge. You possess the power to immortalize a chieftain's deeds, or, conversely, to damn him in public verse. This made your role both revered and precarious. Historians still argue whether bards held more influence in rural clans or at the royal courts, but what's certain is that their status was a complex mix of privilege and vulnerability. You should also know that not all bards were equal. The system was hierarchical. The alum was the highest rank, essentially a professor of poetry, followed by various grades beneath, each with different social standings and responsibilities. Achieving the status of alum required years of rigorous study, mastering strict poetic forms and meters that would make even a modern-day poet wince. But the power of these words also came with responsibility and consequences. Missteps in poetry, disrespect to patrons, or failure to uphold the bardic code often led to unusual and sometimes peculiar punishments. Unlike simple fines or imprisonment, bardic penalties could involve public shaming, banishment, or even enforced silence, an ironic fate for those whose livelihood was speech. As you settle in tonight, remember that the bards of medieval Ireland were more than artists. They were social arbiters wielding the pen like a weapon. Their lives remind us that in a world ruled by honor and words, the line between praise and punishment was as thin as a finely spun verse. You find yourself drifting deeper into the world where poetry isn't just art but a powerful force that shapes society's very fabric. In medieval Ireland, the power of words was profound. Poetry was more than mere entertainment. It was a social contract and a tool for influence. You see, poets were the historians, the news broadcasters, and the public opinion makers of their time. Their verses preserved genealogies, immortalized heroic deeds, and subtly guided the morals and behaviors of their communities. Imagine sitting around a fire as a bard recites a poem praising a noble clan's ancestry. That verse isn't just flattering words, it's a declaration of legitimacy and power. To slight a clan or leader in verse was to threaten their social standing and, sometimes, their very survival. That's why insults carried a weight unlike what you might find in casual modern banter. You probably didn't realize that poetry was taken so seriously that a single insulting line could ignite feuds lasting generations. In fact, historians still argue whether bardic insults were the main sparks for some of Ireland's most notorious clan conflicts. These verbal duels, sometimes called flighting, were exchanges of insults in verse, carefully crafted to wound an opponent's honor without crossing into physical violence, though that didn't always hold. It might surprise you that these flightings could be as much about wit as malice. A skilled bard could compose insults so cleverly veiled in metaphor and allegory that they'd cause a stir without seeming outright offensive. Sort of like the medieval version of a sarcastic tweet that everyone knows is aimed at someone, but no one says it outright. And it wasn't just about offense. Poetry carried blessings and curses, predictions of fortune or doom. When a bard composed a poem praising a leader's bravery or generosity, it enhanced that person's reputation far beyond what modern advertising could achieve. Conversely, a well-crafted curse verse could tarnish a leader's name for decades. This extraordinary influence explains why the Irish placed strict expectations on their poets. They weren't free spirits drifting with the muse, they were professionals, bound by rules and codes. These codes ensured that the poet's art served society's greater good, preserving order rather than chaos. So, you're starting to see why words mattered more than swords here. The bard's pen could carve out legacies or erase them, and that made the role both mighty and precarious. Next, we'll uncover those rules, the bard's code, that guided their craft and behavior. You drift gently into the rigid world of the bard's code, a set of rules and expectations that shaped not only what poets could say but also how they lived. Unlike the romanticized image of a free-spirited artist, the medieval Irish bard was more akin to a highly disciplined professional, bound by strict customs that governed their speech, conduct, and even personal relationships. Picture yourself as a bard in training in one of the famed bardic schools scattered across Ireland. For years, you memorize intricate poetic forms, meter patterns, and a vast corpus of legends and genealogies. Your life is regimented by the need to master these artful complexities. There's no room for improvisation or sloppy verse here. Historians still argue whether the bardic schools were more like universities or guilds, but what's clear is the enormous commitment required to earn the rank of alum, or master poet. The code also dictated your behavior outside the classroom. Bards were expected to maintain a high standard of decorum, showing respect to their patrons and peers. You wouldn't just blurt out whatever came to mind. You had to weigh each word carefully, knowing that your verses could uplift or destroy reputations. Breaking this code wasn't taken lightly. For instance, there was an unspoken rule about loyalty to one's patrons. If you praised a chieftain in glowing terms, you owed that leader unwavering support, at least publicly. Yet, subtle satire was a bard's way of pointing out flaws or political missteps without causing outright offense. The art was in walking that fine line. Cross it, and you risked severe consequences. Privileges also came with these responsibilities. Bards were often granted land, exemption from certain taxes, and protection under law, essentially a medieval artist's welfare package. They had the right to travel freely and were sometimes even considered part of the aristocracy. But this elevated status came with strings attached. Failure to adhere to the code could lead to swift and public punishment. Interestingly, the bardic code extended into the realm of oral contracts. A bard's spoken word was a binding promise, carrying legal weight in a society where literacy was rare. This made the role a curious blend of artist, lawyer, and social critic. You can almost hear the pressure in the air as a bard carefully crafts his next verse, knowing the entire clan listens intently. And if you thought this all sounds pretty serious, wait till you hear about the consequences for stepping out of line, consequences that were as imaginative as the poetry itself. But before we get there, it's worth pausing to appreciate how these codes preserve an oral tradition that kept Irish culture vibrant for centuries. So, as you settle back, maybe let your mind wander through those medieval halls, where every word was weighed like gold and every syllable had the power to make or break a legacy. Next, we'll explore what happened when a bard's performance failed to meet expectations, and why that was no small matter. You settle further into the tale of what happens when the delicate dance of bardic performance falters, when poetry misfires, where storytelling stumbles. In the world of medieval Irish bards, a poor performance wasn't just an artistic failure, it was a social offense with consequences as tangible as a slap on the wrist, or more accurately, a public spectacle designed to remind you of your place. Picture this. You're the bard standing before the assembled court or clan, ready to spin your verses praising your patron's valor, but the words strip clumsily from your tongue, the rhythm falters, and the once eager audience grows restless. The hush turns to murmurs. In a society where reputation was everything, this wasn't a private embarrassment, it was a public crisis. You might think, well, so what? Everyone messes up sometimes. But in medieval Ireland, the stakes were higher. The bard's craft was tied directly to honor and respect, and failing to deliver could erode not only your standing but that of your patron. After all, a badly composed poem might be interpreted as an insult, intentional or not. One of the most common forms of punishment for such failures was public humiliation. Imagine being forced to wear a ridiculous costume or carry an object symbolizing your failure during a communal feast. The goal? To visually mark you as having disgraced your role and to remind the community of the high standards bards were expected to uphold. This theatrical shaming could last for hours or even days. There are accounts of bards having to sing their botched verses repeatedly while being pelted with rotten food or mockingly cheered. Sounds rough, but remember, in a time when physical punishments were often harsher, these humiliations served as a relatively gentle, albeit mortifying, correction. Historians still argue whether such public shaming was a formalized part of bardic culture or a series of anecdotes amplified over time. What's undeniable is that the bard's reputation was fragile, and failing to meet the community's artistic expectations invited serious social consequences. Interestingly, some bards turned these punishments into performances themselves, adding a touch of humor and self-awareness that endeared them even more to their audiences. Think of it as medieval cringe comedy, where the offender diffused tension by leaning into the embarrassment. So, as you relax into this curious aspect of bardic life, picture the blend of art, society, and subtle cruelty that shaped the experience. Coming up next, the bard's sharpest weapon, cursed verses, where words could wound far more deeply than a bad rhyme. You drift now into the darker, yet fascinating, side of bardic artistry, the infamous cursed verses. These weren't just casual jabs, they were sharp, deliberate poems designed to wound reputations and settle scores. Imagine the bard's pen as a sword, its tip dipped not in ink but in social poison, carefully crafted to sting like a nettle on bare skin. In medieval Ireland, The curse verse was the bard's sharpest weapon and a recognized form of social control. If flattery was the balm that soothed egos and built alliances, then curses were the fire that purged wrongdoing and defended honor. These verses were public declarations of disfavor, often invoking supernatural elements to predict misfortune on the target. Picture a bard standing before a crowd, reciting a carefully constructed poem that calls down all manner of ill fate upon a rival chieftain. The curse might speak of failed crops, broken families, or endless quarrels. To modern ears, this might sound like something out of a fantasy novel, but in the context of medieval Ireland, these words carried significant weight. Interestingly, these curse verses often employed intricate poetic devices, such as alliteration, assonance, and metaphor, making them not only threatening but also artistically impressive. It was a strange combination, beauty and menace wrapped in a single stanza. You might be amused to learn that some bards specialized in composing these satirical curses, making a living by turning social tensions into verse. This, of course, made them both feared and sought after, a double-edged reputation. Historians still debate how much power these curses actually wielded. Some argue they were purely performative, a form of ritualized insult without real-world consequences. Others suggest that, given the deep belief in the supernatural in Irish society, such curses could inspire genuine fear and provoke serious reactions, even violence. What's clear is that these verses weren't haphazard insults but carefully crafted compositions that demanded the highest poetic skill. A badly made curse would be as embarrassing as a failed praise poem, and risk the same kind of punishment. So, as you ease into this fascinating mix of art and menace, remember that the bard's curse was both a weapon and a form of justice, a way to keep society's intricate honor codes in balance through the power of words alone. Next, we'll explore what happened when words weren't enough, how banishment and exile came into play as more physical forms of bardic punishment. You drift deeper into the harsher realities faced by some bards when words fail to settle scores or mend offenses, banishment and exile. In medieval Ireland, social exclusion was no trivial matter. Being cast out from your community meant severing ties to your identity, livelihood, and often survival. For a bard, whose craft was tied to audiences and patrons, exile was both a professional and personal catastrophe. Picture yourself as a bard whose sharp tongue, or perhaps unfortunate misstep, has earned the ire of a powerful lord. You find yourself told to pack your few belongings and leave the court, or worse, the entire region. The open road stretches before you, uncertain and lonely, far from the warm halls and familiar faces where your verses once commanded respect. Banishment was a punishment that carried a heavy symbolic weight. It was a public declaration that you no longer belonged. For bards, whose influence depended on social networks and the ability to perform before sympathetic ears, exile meant a cruel silencing. You could no longer uphold your role as storyteller, genealogist, or social critic. Some bards were sentenced to exile for offending their patrons or for political reasons, like backing the wrong faction in a clan rivalry. Others faced banishment for breaking the bardic code or for failing to meet artistic standards. The reasons were varied, but the outcome was consistently severe. Interestingly, historical records suggest that some exiled bards found refuge in other courts or regions, relying on their reputation and skills to secure new patrons. This wandering lifestyle had its own risks and rewards, and some poets embraced it, becoming itinerant minstrels before the more famous wandering bards of later centuries. Historians still debate how often banishment was actually enforced versus being threatened as a form of intimidation. Some argue that exile was more a symbolic threat to keep bards in line than a frequently used punishment. However, tales of exiled poets struggling to reclaim their status appear throughout Irish lore. You might find it curious that in some cases, bards were also ostracized in ritualized ways short of full exile, barred from speaking at courts or excluded from particular festivals, effectively silencing them socially without sending them packing. As you settle back into the story, imagine the loneliness and uncertainty of a bard walking away from everything they knew, clutching only their words as a lifeline. Next, we'll explore how money, those practical coins, factored into bardic punishments in the form of fines and compensations. You find yourself considering the practical side of bardic life, how offenses and mistakes weren't only dealt with through public shaming or exile but also through the cold, hard reality of money. In medieval Ireland, economic penalties played the surprisingly central role in maintaining social order, and the world of bards was no exception. Imagine you're a bard who has, perhaps inadvertently, insulted a noble family with a careless line or failed to fulfill your poetic obligations. Instead of, or sometimes alongside, public humiliation, you might be required to pay a fine or offer compensation. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. It was a calculated punishment designed to restore balance and demonstrate accountability. The legal framework governing such fines was detailed in the Brehon Laws, the native Irish legal system that predates English common law. These laws meticulously assigned values to insults, breaches of contracts, and personal offenses. Bards, as highly respected professionals, were both entitled to compensation for their services and liable for penalties if they misused their craft. Fines could vary widely depending on the severity of the offense and the social status of those involved. For example, insulting a powerful chieftain might cost you a hefty sum, while offending a minor clan member might result in a more modest fee. Sometimes, fines were paid in cattle, which were the primary currency of wealth at the time, or in silver if available. You might chuckle to think that the bard's tongue was literally insured. The art of balancing praise and criticism was not just a creative challenge but a financial necessity, and failure to maintain that balance could drain your pockets. Historians still argue whether these fines were more often symbolic or rigorously enforced. Some evidence suggests that social pressures often encouraged settlement through compensation rather than prolonged feuding, which was costly for everyone involved. Interestingly, bards themselves sometimes acted as negotiators or mediators in disputes, leveraging their unique position to convert conflicts into poetic settlements. This dual role as both artist and peacemaker adds a fascinating layer to their social function. So, as you sink deeper into the story, consider the bard's world as one where words had literal price tags, and poetic skill was as much about diplomacy and economics as artistry. Next, we'll wander through the theatrical public shaming rituals designed to keep errant bards in line. You gently ease into the theatrical world of public shaming rituals, a kind of medieval performance art with a stern social purpose. In the tight-knit communities of medieval Ireland, keeping bards accountable wasn't just about fines or exile. It often involved elaborate ceremonies designed to humiliate and correct, all performed under the watchful eyes of the clan. Imagine a bard who's committed some transgression, maybe a misjudged insult or a poetic blunder, being paraded before the community in a specially designed ritual. You might see them dressed in garish clothing, or even adorned with symbols of disgrace, like a dunce cap's medieval cousin. These rituals served as a vivid reminder that while bards were powerful voices, they were also servants of social order. These public shaming events could be surprisingly creative. Some accounts describe bards being made to sit on a stool of repentance in the village square, forced to recite their faults or even their own mistakes aloud. Others were subjected to mock ceremonies where they had to wear symbols representing their crime, such as a necklace of straw or a painted sign declaring their failure. You might be tickled by tales of bards being spanked with bunches of rushes, reeds commonly found near rivers, as a symbolic punishment that's more awkward than painful. It's a reminder that, beneath the seriousness, there was a touch of absurdity to these customs. Historians still argue whether some of these rituals were widespread or largely exaggerated in later retellings. However, the consensus remains that public humiliation was a favored tool for maintaining social cohesion, especially among groups with strong oral traditions where reputation mattered immensely. These ceremonies also functioned as communal catharsis, an opportunity for the group to collectively reinforce norms while allowing the offender to eventually reintegrate. The bard, after enduring the spectacle, could regain respect by demonstrating humility and improving their craft. As you settle into this curious blend of justice and theater, picture the mingling of laughter and solemnity as communities enforced their codes with equal parts seriousness and humor. Next, we'll explore a particularly ironic punishment: imposed muteness and restrictions on speech. You drift now into a truly ironic corner of bardic punishment: imposed muteness and speech restrictions. For poets whose very livelihood depended on the spoken word, being silenced was akin to losing a limb, an almost unimaginable fate that carried both practical hardship and symbolic weight. Imagine a bard who has gone too far, perhaps by insulting a powerful lord or breaking the bardic code in some grievous way. Instead of being banished outright or publicly shamed, this bard faces a more civil but deeply cutting penalty, a formal order forbidding him to speak or perform for a set period. In effect, he is rendered mute, not physically, but socially and legally. This wasn't just a casual, quiet down, but a binding prohibition backed by the community and its leaders. You can picture the bard's frustration, the silent weight of a craft rendered useless. Historians still argue whether this punishment was more common than exile or fines, but it's clear it held a terrifying place in the bardic justice system. Interestingly, these speech restrictions could vary in severity and duration. Some bards were barred only from certain courts or gatherings, while others faced total silence throughout an entire region. It's a punishment that controlled not only behavior but influence, cutting off the bard's ability to shape opinions and histories. You might find it amusing, if a little tragic, that a bard could be forced to communicate only through gestures or written words, though literacy wasn't widespread. The irony was palpable: the master of words, stilled. Some accounts suggest that bards used this period of silence for reflection and study, honing their craft in quiet exile until they were allowed to speak again. It's almost like a medieval forced sabbatical, though with a heavy social stigma. This punishment also served as a powerful warning to others, showing that no matter how talented or influential, a bard was never above the social order. Speech, the bard's greatest tool, could be taken away, stripping them of power. As you relax into this tale of enforced silence, consider how much speech meant to these poets and how devastating its loss could be. Next, we'll examine how gender shaped bardic punishments and the unique challenges faced by female poets in medieval Ireland. You now drift into the quieter, often overlooked world of female poets in medieval Ireland, women who, despite living in a male-dominated bardic tradition, found their voices and faced unique challenges and punishments. While much of the surviving history focuses on male bards, glimpses of women's roles reveal a fascinating and nuanced picture. Imagine a woman trained in poetry, storytelling, or songcraft, navigating the same strict bardic codes that governed her male counterparts, but often with fewer privileges and greater scrutiny. Female poets had to balance artistic expression with societal expectations about gender roles, and stepping outside those boundaries could invite punishments as peculiar as those faced by men, but sometimes more socially restrictive. For example, women who used satire or sharp verses risked accusations not just of breaking bardic rules but also of defying feminine decorum. Their words could be seen as more transgressive simply because they challenged expected modesty. This meant punishments might include social ostracism, loss of patronage, or restrictions on where and when they could perform. Historians still debate how widespread female participation in bardic traditions truly was, with some arguing that women's roles were largely informal or oral rather than institutionalized in bardic schools. However, literary fragments and folklore suggest women wielded poetic influence, especially in intimate or local contexts. Interestingly, some female poets became renowned for their laments or elegies, a genre where emotional expression was accepted and even valued. Yet, even in this space, crossing the line into sharp satire could lead to repercussions, sometimes more severe due to gendered double standards. You might find it curious that while male bards could rely on legal protections tied to their professional status, female poets often lacked such formal backing, making them more vulnerable to social punishment. The stakes were higher, and the path narrower. As you settle into this gentle exploration of gender and bardic life, picture the courage and subtle defiance it took for these women to raise their voices amid societal constraints. Coming next, we'll dive into the fierce rivalries between bards and how competitive clashes sometimes ended in punishments or feuds. You ease into the spirited world of bardic rivalries, where competition wasn't just friendly banter but a high-stakes contest of wit, skill, and sometimes outright hostility. In medieval Ireland, poets were not only artists but rivals vying for prestige, patronage, and influence, and these rivalries occasionally escalated into punishments or long-standing feuds. Imagine two bards meeting at a royal court or a local festival, each eager to outshine the other with clever verses and sharp satire. The air crackles with tension as they exchange poetic barbs, their words sharpened like swords. The stakes: honor, reputation, and sometimes even the favor of powerful patrons. Clashes could be fierce, with each bard crafting elaborate insults known as flighting, a ritualized exchange of verses meant to humiliate the opponent. While mostly verbal, these battles could have serious social consequences. A poorly judged insult might provoke a feud between clans or lead to a bard being punished for disrupting the peace. You might be amused to learn that some bards specialized in this kind of verbal sparring, turning rivalry into a form of entertainment. Yet, when tensions ran high, rulers or elders sometimes stepped in to impose penalties, ranging from fines to temporary bans on performing on the more aggressive poets. Historians still debate how much these rivalries contributed to wider social conflicts. Some suggest that bardic disputes acted as safety valves, allowing tensions to be aired in a controlled, artistic manner. Others argue they sometimes fanned flames that erupted into violence. What's clear is that the world of medieval Irish bards was as much about politics and power as about poetry. Rivalries were personal and public, blending artistic excellence with strategic maneuvering. As you relax into this lively glimpse of bardic competition, imagine the vibrant, electric atmosphere of these poetic showdowns, where words could wound as deeply as any weapon. Next, we'll see how these disputes intersected with the broader legal system and the authority of medieval Irish rulers. You glide now into the intersection of bardic life with the medieval Irish legal system, a fascinating confluence of poetry, social norms, and authority. In a society governed by the Brehon laws, bards weren't merely artists but legal actors, their words sometimes carrying official weight, their offenses subject to judicial scrutiny. Imagine a bard standing before a local ruler or a Brehon judge, accused of insulting a noble or breaching the bardic code. The legal system could impose punishments ranging from fines to exile, depending on the severity of the offense, but unlike modern courts, justice here was deeply intertwined with oral tradition and social reputation. The Brehon laws detailed many aspects of bardic conduct, recognizing the profession's importance and regulating its boundaries. For example, laws stipulated the compensation a bard should receive for services rendered and the penalties for insults or breach of contract. This legal codification helped maintain social order by balancing the bard's privileges with accountability. You might find it intriguing that bards sometimes acted as legal witnesses or mediators, their knowledge of genealogy and customs crucial in settling disputes. Their poetry could be used as evidence in court, reinforcing the truth of claims or condemning wrongdoing. Historians still argue about how rigidly these laws were enforced, especially given the oral nature of much of medieval Irish society. Some suggest that local rulers exercised discretion, using bardic punishments as political tools or favors rather than strict justice. Interestingly, the law recognized different ranks of poets, each with corresponding rights and responsibilities, adding layers of complexity to bardic justice. An alum might enjoy greater protections and command higher fees, while lower-ranked bards had fewer privileges. As you relax into this intricate weave of art and law, picture the bard as both artist and legal actor, words serving as instruments of culture, justice, and power. Next, we'll wander into the realm of the odd and curious, bizarre bardic punishments that seem almost stranger than fiction. You find yourself wandering into the realm of the odd and curious, those bizarre bardic punishments that seem almost stranger than fiction. In medieval Ireland, where symbolism and ritual shaped much of social life, punishments for bards could take on imaginative and unexpected forms, designed not only to chastise but to entertain and instruct. Imagine a bard found guilty of some breach, perhaps an insult too sharp or a verse poorly composed, being subjected to an unusual penalty, such as wearing a ridiculous costume or being made to perform a comical dance before the court. These punishments were meant to publicly mark the offender, blending humiliation with spectacle. One particularly quirky punishment involved the bard being forced to carry an oversized or symbolic object during public appearances, like a large reed or a wooden spoon, signifying their foolishness or failure. It's as if medieval Ireland invented its own version of a scarlet letter, but with a touch of humor. You might smile to learn about the so-called poet's pillory, a ritual where a bard would be publicly displayed, not bound in stocks but compelled to recite self-deprecating verses while the crowd watched. This mix of shame and entertainment helped maintain community bonds by reinforcing social norms through laughter. Historians still debate whether some of these punishments were widespread practices or occasional anecdotes embellished over time. The line between ritual, legend, and fact is often blurred, especially given the oral tradition through which these stories survived. Interestingly, these odd punishments also serve as a form of social pressure valve, allowing communities to address breaches of conduct without resorting to harsher physical penalties. By turning punishment into performance, they maintained a balance of justice and mercy. As you ease into this whimsical chapter, imagine the mingling of laughter, shame, and artistic expression that mark these punishments, reminding us that medieval justice had room for creativity and communal involvement. Next, we'll touch on the ongoing debate among historians: how much of bardic punishment is fact, and how much is legend spun from the rich tapestry of Irish storytelling. You now drift into the intriguing scholarly debate about bardic punishments, a conversation swirling with questions of fact, fiction, and everything in between. Medieval Ireland's bardic tradition lives in a liminal space where history and legend intertwine, leaving historians to puzzle over how much of what we know is rooted in reality and how much is shaped by myth-making. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit university library, poring over ancient manuscripts, legal tracts, and poetic fragments that hint at the colorful world of bardic discipline. Some scholars argue that many tales of elaborate punishments were exaggerated or symbolic, crafted by later storytellers to enhance the drama of bardic life. Others insist that the detailed legal codes and eyewitness accounts found in early Irish literature support the existence of real, enforceable bardic penalties. They point to the Brehon Law's meticulous attention to bardic conduct as evidence that punishments were codified and administered with seriousness. You might find it fascinating that some punishments could have functioned as rituals reinforcing social cohesion rather than purely punitive measures. Public shaming, for example, might have been more about community healing than retribution. Historians still argue whether bards ever faced physical penalties like corporal punishment or if their discipline was confined to fines, exile, and social sanctions. The oral nature of many sources complicates attempts to separate fact from folklore. Furthermore, some modern interpretations suggest that tales of bardic punishment serve as cautionary stories, teaching aspiring poets the importance of adhering to their code without necessarily reflecting common practice. As you relax into this ongoing debate, consider how the bardic tradition itself embodies the tension between storytelling and history, where truth and legend dance together like intertwined verses. Next, we'll conclude by reflecting on the enduring legacy of these peculiar punishments and their influence on how we view poetry, insult, and artistic freedom today. You drift softly toward the legacy of medieval Irish bardic punishments and their surprising influence on modern notions of poetry, insult, and artistic freedom. Though centuries have passed since bards roamed the misty hills and courtly halls, their echoes remain, whispering through the way we think about words' power and the boundaries of creative expression. Imagine how those ancient punishments, whether public shaming, banishment, or imposed silence, serve as early reminders that with artistic freedom comes responsibility. Even today, poets, comedians, and writers navigate the delicate balance between bold expression and social consequence, a tension that medieval bards knew all too well. You might smile, knowing that modern roast battles or slam poetry nights carry a faint echo of those medieval flightings, where verbal duels were both entertainment and social commentary. The bardic tradition laid groundwork for understanding the fine line between humor and offense, art and insult. Historians still argue how directly the bardic punishments influenced later European literary cultures, but the idea that words could wound or heal, elevate or degrade, remains timeless. In Ireland, this legacy is cherished, with modern poets honoring the old forms and the weight words carried. As you begin to drift towards sleep, let the story of the bard's peculiar punishments remind you that language is a living force, capable of shaping worlds, forging bonds, and, yes, calling out those who misuse it. Now, slow your breathing, feel the soft hum of the night around you, and let these gentle tales fade like the last flickers of a dying hearth. Rest easy knowing that in every whispered word and quiet verse, the spirit of the bard lives on.